Can RTI enhance young children's development, and what are the challenges? I'm Doris McMillan. Please join me for the RTI National Online Forum, Implementing Response to Intervention in Early Childhood Settings.
This RTI National Online Forum is presented by the RTI Action Network, a program of the National Center for Learning Disabilities. Funding is provided by the Emily Hall Tremaine Foundation.
Hello everyone, I'm Doris McMillan and welcome to the RTI National Online Forum. Today we're going to talk with 4 top experts about implementing RTI, or Response to Intervention, in early childhood settings. Joining me, we have Dr. Jim Lesko. He is the Director of Early Development and Learning Resources for the Delaware Department of Education in Dover, Delaware. Dr. Lydia Carlis is Director of Education at Apple Tree Institute and Apple Tree Early Learning Public Charter School in Washington, D.C. Dr. Virginia Buysse, Senior Scientist at the Frank Porter Graham Child Development Institute at the University of North Carolina. And Dr. Charlie Greenwood. He is the Professor of Applied Behavioral Science at the University of Kansas. He also serves as co-principal investigator for the Center for RTI in Early Childhood. I'd also like to welcome our studio audience and those who are joining us online. Now, later on in the show, we're going to take questions here in the studio and we'll answer a few that we've received by email. So I'd like to say thank you all for joining us. And let's, to get our program started, Virginia, I'd like to try to cover the basics of RTI with you. We're going to get into more specifics later on, but for now, what are the key features of early childhood RTI model?
Well, Doris, RTI is essentially a framework that can help practitioners link assessment to instruction. So if you take that basic definition, there are a couple of key components.
Okay.
The first is the assessment component. And within RTI, there's a particular type of assessment that's used, and it's called formative assessment. It's called formative because the assessment relies on information that's gathered on children's behavior and skills, and it's used to inform instructional decisions. The other component is the instructional component, of course, and that consists of the sort of core instruction that all children receive in the form of a core curriculum and intentional teaching, but layered on top of that are the tiered interventions and supports that some children need. And a third component are the supports for making database decisions. And so there are a couple of ideas around that concept, and one is that there needs to be a mechanism by which parents and teachers and specialists can collaborate and work together to solve problems. And in addition, they need some criteria for how to make decisions. So benchmarks about what are the key domains of learning for children at this age so that they can understand what goals should be accomplished. Mm-hmm. Also some criteria for determining which children might need some additional supports based on assessments.
All right, thank you so much. Jim, let me move to you. How is RTI different in early childhood than in the K through 12 settings?
Well, Doris, there are several differences, I think, that need to be considered. The first would be, and it's a major issue, is funding. Within the K-12 system, there are some more firm funding resources that are available. IDEA makes some specific resources available through their comprehensive early intervening services component of that. Whereas below kindergarten, it's much more difficult to identify funding, and it's often necessary for districts and programs to be very creative around that process. The second component would be around the competencies and resources that are available to programs below kindergarten. We're often dealing with a very different population of practitioners, some that come into the setting with less knowledge than what we might find in a K-12 system. I guess the third component would be the settings. In a K-12 system, we have school buildings, we have classrooms. Below kindergarten, we're looking at preschool programs, child care centers, day daycare, family childcare. So there are some distinct differences across settings.
Okay, thank you, Jim. Charlie, we hear a lot about evidence-based practice in education today. What's the evidence-based practice in an early childhood setting?
Yeah, I think there are two aspects to that I like to tell folks. And one is that the practices that are being selected and used in those settings are based on evidence supporting their efficacy and the fact that they produce superior results compared to other options that might be out there. The second component is using locally collected data, as Virginia said, locally collected data by the teachers as part of the decision making as regards what level of intervention support that the children should receive. So those two aspects, I think, are the main features.
Okay, thank you. And Lydia, why do early childhood programs and our children need RTI? That's my first question, and I'm going to follow up with another.
Well, if you look just at reading, at the research on reading, 5 to 10% of children who come to kindergarten ready need intervening services after, but 65 to 70% of children who come to kindergarten and they are not prepared for kindergarten need intervening services throughout their school career.
Okay, and we're kind of looking for some context here. Don't all young children develop skills at different rates?
People definitely develop skills at different rates, but there are developmental guidelines for what we know children should be able to do at different ages. And as a social justice issue, we really want to ensure that it's not certain children who are not ready and prepared. And right now we see through data across the nation that African American students and children who are English language learners are disproportionately represented in special education and other areas where they're not getting the services that they need early on. So response to intervention in early childhood can support that.
Okay, so it's not to say that they are they have special education needs, they're just not getting all the resources.
They have not received the supports that they need early on to mitigate some of those deficits.
Okay, Virginia, what do you see are the biggest misconceptions that people have about RTI in early childhood settings?
I think the most potentially harmful one that I've run into is the idea that RTI in early childhood, in particular pre-K, is going to replace existing referral and evaluation systems to determine whether or not children are eligible for special education. There are some provisions within IDEA for how this could work with older school-age students, but there are no specific provisions or guidelines for how RTI could be used for this purpose with younger children. And so this is, in my view, a dangerous practice. It is one that is particularly relevant to Head Start programs right now. And that's a problem and a misconception, and in some ways is giving RTI a bad name, in my opinion.
How do you fix that?
I think one thing is we need policies. We need specific policies to address this issue head on, so that we can debunk some of these urban myths that are out there, quite honestly.
All right. Tell us, if you would, how RTI really works. And, I understand that it rests on a foundation of high-quality instruction, but how do you define what's high-quality Tier 1 instruction?
So you gave me the easy question, right?
Sure.
So the answer to that could fill a textbook, quite honestly. What do we mean by high quality? But fortunately, we've got national organizations that have really focused their efforts on that question, and they have developed some quality frameworks. So they essentially, organizations like the National Association for the Education for Young Children, the Division for Early Childhood, Head Start, have defined program standards and personnel standards that essentially tell us what early learning environments should look like, the qualifications of the staff in those programs, the teaching practices, health and safety factors, and so forth. So we have good definitions of that. In addition, states are working on this too. They're creating their own quality accountability systems. And they're doing it through this mechanism called quality rating improvement systems. I think Jim was telling me earlier that about 25 states now have these quality rating improvement systems that essentially allow them to set standards for what quality looks like, and to measure it and to evaluate and they're actually rewarding programs on the basis of meeting these standards. Now, with respect to RTI, I think we look for a few key components to be in place. At a minimum, we're looking to see that programs actually have a comprehensive core curriculum and that they're using it. Okay. In addition, we want to see some intentional teaching going on. In other words, they're not just putting that curriculum on the shelf.
Right.
They are using it. Children are having opportunities to learn language and literacy and mathematics concepts. And so before we start trying to understand which children need additional supports, let's make sure that the foundation is there.
Right. Absolutely. Now, beyond the core, did you want to comment, Jim? Okay. Beyond the core instruction, a tiered system of interventions also available for children who need additional support. So tell us about those tiers.
Well, the tiers are really just a way to help practitioner organize the assessment and intervention practices at each level. And so typically there are 3 tiers. And that first tier is the foundation of an RTI system. And it addresses both the assessment component as well as the instructional component. As I mentioned, that foundation is having a core curriculum and teaching it. The assessment component is called universal screening, typically at Tier 1. And it really is about gathering information on every single child periodically throughout the school year, so that you have a sense of where children are in terms of meeting basic learning goals. And you can use that information to determine which children might need additional supports. As you move up the tiers, you start to focus on some children. So whereas Tier 1 focused on all children, Tier 2 focuses on some children who might need some additional supports. And the assessment component as well focuses on some of those children to gather additional information to determine their responsiveness to the interventions that you provide.
So by the end of the year, they've gone through this assessment.
Yes.
How should they be looking at the end of the year?
So hopefully we have benchmarks, and in many states and programs we have something called early learning guidelines or standards that essentially tell us what children should know and be able to do. I'm not sure we've done a great job in early childhood of saying at what point in the year they should know these things, but at a minimum, we know that by the end of preschool, before children enter kindergarten, what key skills they should know and be able to do.
Okay. Lydia, how do you identify the children who need those supplemental interventions?
Well, as Charlie and Virginia were just saying, we start with the data. So we assess children in the domains that the standards address to understand where children are at the beginning of the year and how far they have to go to get to those benchmarks by the end of the year. And then the classroom teacher, hopefully with some support, can use those data to make informed decisions about the high quality Tier 1 instruction that he or she is providing to all children in the classroom, and then using that ongoing data that's collected throughout the year to see which children. And so the children who are not responding at the same rate as their peers would be the students who the teachers would provide additional support to.
Okay. Charlie, what are the most useful tools for gathering the RTI data?
Yeah, the most useful tools are those that can reveal short-term growth and progress and mastery. And by short-term, I mean on the scale of a weekly, monthly, or quarterly. And things kind of vary, but the idea here is that teachers have a rich source of information on a short-term basis that allows them to make the decisions that were just described, either to move a child to a more intensive level of service, or in the best of circumstances, to move them from a higher tier down to a lower tier because the instruction has been helpful and moved them along.
Now, are there different types of data used for different purposes?
Well, always, I guess, that is a possibility. But in RTI, the data supports two main functions and two main goals. One is the screening. That typically, that screening could be in the first of the year, and in many cases it may be done quarterly in the year. And the universal screen is done to identify children that would possibly benefit from a higher or intensity of service. The second purpose is progress monitoring, and Virginia mentioned that. And progress monitoring, again, is for children that are receiving a higher tier of service. How are they doing? And that data on progress lets us know that they're on trajectory or they're on a path that will get them to the goals that we have set for them by a particular point in time.
Okay. Lydia, let me come back to you. What's been your experience with this?
With using data to
Yes.
inform instruction? At Apple Tree, we've been able to support a few different schools in implementing response to intervention, and we have been able to start with baseline data. We use norm-referenced assessments, so starting out with standardized assessments so that we can compare students against their national peers and not just locally. But we also use curriculum-based assessments so that we know how children are performing against the curriculum that we're teaching. And so we can take those data, use them with teachers to help map the standardized assessments against the standards for instruction, so the teachers can make meaning of those data and then begin to implement high-quality instruction in the classrooms.
Okay. Jim, let me come to you. For schools that are new to using the data this way, where do they begin?
Well, I think it's critical to take some time to assess the capacity and the capabilities of the individuals that are collecting the data. Most practitioners, when they go through their pre-service or in-service training programs, typically don't have coursework that involves taking data, analyzing data, going through a problem-solving process. So our recommendation, our experiences have been that you need to take some time first to put together some good professional development opportunities, showing teachers that data is not a scary thing, that data is an easy process to take. Often teachers, I think, feel overwhelmed around, oh, I have to take so much data. And we were talking previously that it's most helpful to begin with teachers to target, say, one area of behavior or a child's performance, and teach them how to collect the data, show them, help them to develop some forms to collect that data. And then after it's done, working with their colleagues to do some brainstorming and problem solving. So we have all this information, what is it really saying, and how can I then use that information for instructional planning purposes?
Could I add
Sure.
to what Jim, I just want to build on what Jim has just said, because I think it's so important. When we've had collaborative problem-solving meetings that consist of teachers who are trying to implement RTI, and we bring in the data that essentially are the results of the information the teachers themselves have gathered, they get so excited about that. It's the first time that they have actually seen assessment that they've been involved in used for a specific purpose that is completely relevant to them. And so it's sitting in the room watching teachers pore over their data and seeing that you can actually look and find children who are performing better than others. Some are performing at the top end, some are in the middle, and then you have those who are performing at the bottom. And teachers are very interested in trying to address the needs of those students and using the data that they've gathered to figure out which students could best benefit from the instruction that they're going to provide them is just, it's wonderful to observe that.
It's like having a really clear roadmap.
Exactly.
And how to follow
Exactly.
it. Yeah, great. All right, let me address this question to you all. How is all the student data collected and then analyzed? And then what can early childhood programs do to streamline the data analysis process? And so if we could, we'd get several examples from different programs. Lydia, let me start with you.
At Apple Tree, the data are collected different ways each year as we learn our mistakes from the previous year. But what we've settled on recently is having data entered directly into forms that teachers can use immediately. So when the data are entered, they immediately color code and the teachers know if their child is performing high, mid, or low. And at the bottom of the page, the teacher can see what is their class median score, what is the mean. And of course, we've had to do some professional development at the beginning to explain what those means, but what that means, but they get the colors.
Right.
So they can sort and, you know, make instructional groupings right away. So they don't have to wait for us to turn around data to them and give them a report. They can just start right away making instructional decisions as soon as the data are entered.
Okay, Charlie.
Can I? Yeah,
Sure.
I'd like to follow up. And so that the processes that allow for teachers to quickly get access to their results is critical to RTI success. And because if the data is collected and it's put in a filing cabinet somewhere, then it's not operating at all. And what we want it to do is inform the teachers about how they're doing, and help them with their planning, and help them with their understanding of where their children are and how what their next needs are.
Exactly. Virginia, any follow-up on that?
Well, I think, you know, teachers are busy. They have a lot of children in their care. And the last thing we want to do is to burden them with yet another task.
Right.
So one of the things we have done is to use technology. So we're not asking teachers to use pencil paper forms of assessment. We give them handheld devices, which they love using. And it's easy to take that, upload it to a web-based assessment system. It prints out reports. And I think if this is going to work, it's got to be efficient, it's got to be easy, and it's got to give teachers access to information pretty quickly.
That's some good immediate gratification,
Yes.
isn't it?
Yes,
Yes. Charlie, what are the benefits of using data to make instructional decisions?
Yeah, I think, well, my opinion is that it helps teachers align their intervention, the intensity of intervention, in Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3, with the child's needs. And that alignment and that shifting of that alignment during the school year, for example, is critical to the progress of the children. Some other benefits I mentioned earlier is the support for planning. Program directors, if they consolidate the data, they can see how many children they're serving in Tier 2 and Tier 3, and they can make strategic decisions about resources they might need for that, what professional development is needed, whether there's a need for more Tier 2 intervention training, and that again allows for program improvement in a faster and more dynamic way than traditionally.
Absolutely. Lydia, how do programs share this information with the parents? And then what is the family's role in the RTI process?
Schools should be starting from the very beginning when parents are enrolling, informing them about response to intervention, about what that looks like at their school. In their parent handbook, they should have information about the RTI process and the referral process, and going over that in parent handbook meetings, back to school night. The parents should be getting information on a consistent basis about the performance of their children, so that they're not finding out when there is a problem that there is a problem. And when they get the information about how their child is performing, at the same time they should be getting information about what the teacher is going to do about it, and then maybe how they could help at home. And using information from the parents is very helpful. So what's the child's interest? What are the strengths that the parent sees at home, and how can the teacher incorporate that information to meet the needs of the child in the classroom?
Okay, as I look around the table, I see heads nodding. Would you all like to weigh in? Jim?
I think it's important also to involve the family, because we need to to take the perspective that intervention doesn't only happen, during the 6 or 8 hours, 2 hours or 8 hours that the child's in care or in education, that the most effective way to support intervention is to see it generalized throughout the course of a child's day. So children typically just don't experience a weakness during literacy time, and that isn't the only time that you can provide some intervention, but the parent can do that during reading a story as well when the child is home. So there's lots of opportunities, and we should take advantage of that.
So I have maybe a slightly different perspective on this. I actually think this is an area where the early childhood field needs to do a lot more work.
How so?
I think we are all espousing the same beliefs around the importance of involving families as partners. I think we need to basically operationalize that and to put it into practice more. I think in the area of RTI, it's really important, but the field is just at such an early stage in figuring this out in terms of the practices in programs that we haven't quite gotten there yet, if you will, about how do we explain this to families.
Right.
I mean, we're still trying to explain it to ourselves. We haven't come up with good ways of explaining what RTI is, and also involving them, engaging them as in the whole process of making decisions and collaborating and so forth. So I think it's an area where we need more work.
Charlie?
Yeah, I agree, but I think we also have some very good evidence supporting parent involvement in these interventions, and particularly at Tier 2 and Tier 3, or Tier 3 particularly, where there's a highly individualized program at that level, and to have a home component of that same intervention being carried out for supporting the child's language development, for example, and teaching the parent some strategies about embedding instruction and routines and things that early childhood, early intervention people really understand, is an asset that we have for that.
But Charlie, I think we have to be a little bit careful here, because sometimes I have heard people say, oh, do we need a tiered approach in homes, in home settings? Should families be implementing tiers? And I think, we just have to be a little bit careful. I think this whole notion of organizing instruction and assessment by level of intensity is one that was developed primarily for center-based or school-based kinds of programs.
Right.
And is not something that should sort of take over home settings. So I just want us to be a little bit careful about, the kind of that boundary.
Yeah, I understand.
Okay. Well, let's come back to the interventions. And Lydia, what I want to ask you is, how are they chosen for each child?
So again, taking into consideration the child's interests and strengths. So when you implement a strength-based assessment, you're starting with what the child is good at already and building the deficits from that strength. So part of choosing the intervention is going to be where the child's strengths and weaknesses. Part of it is going to be logistics. What time does the teacher have throughout his or her school day to actually implement the intervention? And which times, back to student interest, in early childhood, children are going to love recess. So, or at any age maybe. So the teacher might not want to pull the child for an extra intervention during recess. So thinking about the child's preferences and choices and tailoring the intervention so that it meets all of those needs.
Yeah, which kind of was my question, is like, how are the interventions delivered during the school day? We cannot skip recess.
No.
So they're implemented to the maximum extent so that they can feel like a natural part of the child's school day. The child might not know that they're getting an intervention. They might think they're playing an extra game with the teacher, getting some more one-on-one time or small group time to play a fun game. And the purpose of the game for the teacher is intentional instruction to teach a skill. But for the child, it's actually building that social emotional connection with the teacher in addition to helping them learn and be successful in the classroom.
Okay. Virginia, if you would, give us an example of a real school where you've seen the implementation work well.
We've worked in several different schools in Michigan and North Carolina, and we're currently in Miami-Dade County in Florida. And I think in all of those cases we're seeing it work. I think it's all predicated on sound professional development, as Jim already alluded to. and ongoing support. It's not enough to go to 1 or 2 workshops on RTI and you're set to go. You need to have ongoing support as teachers implement this in their classrooms. We provide support through coaches coming into the classroom, through opportunities for teachers to come together on a regular basis to problem solve, to talk about what's working, what's not working. And if you provide those kinds of supports and the resources, it generally works just fine.
Okay. Lydia, can you give us an example?
Sure. At Apple Tree and the schools that we've supported, Apple Tree Early Learning and some other schools in the District of Columbia, where we see the most success is where there's buy-in and accountability from the principal on down. And so that the professional development is aligned with the accountability measures, and the training and support is very much embedded in the classroom on a day-to-day basis. So the teachers are getting that coaching, and they're able to use the data. They're able to look at the data, and if they have questions, there's someone who they can go to ask about that.
Okay. Let's move now into RTI implementation and planning. And Jim, I want to come back to you. If a school is just getting started with RTI, where should they begin?
Well, there are a couple steps, I think, that would be beneficial for a program. The first, and we've alluded to this a little bit, is to spend some time looking at what their basic curriculum and their instructional practices are. I think one of the critical variables that we've uncovered is that in many cases, especially below kindergarten, the curriculum that programs are using tend to be somewhat eclectic, to say it best.
And, we all know what that means.
Yes. And so I think an important component that Virginia mentioned is, number one, is the curriculum linked and aligned to the state's early learning guidelines? Because the early learning guidelines, good early learning guidelines are aligned to the K-12 grade level expectations. So is the curriculum that's being implemented directly aligned to that, so that we know that the instruction that's occurring for those children is meeting their instructional needs? And I think the second thing would be to look at the teachers' interaction styles. Is intentional teaching happening in those classrooms, so that we know that those students are getting the type of instructional practices that we know will help them develop and learn the skills that they need. And I think the second major element is, again, and I've said this before, is to look at the competencies and capacities of the practitioners who are actually going to be implementing both instruction and intervention. When you get below kindergarten, you begin to deal with a very diverse population of practitioners. If you go into child care centers in some states, you're dealing with individuals who have high school diplomas. If you're looking at state pre-kindergarten programs, you may have teachers with bachelor's and master's degrees. So you have to take a step back and first look at what are the competencies that these staff have, and then develop a strong professional development model to ensure that all of those practitioners have the skills they need to be successful.
Yeah, that was almost going to be my next question, and you just answered it. Okay, so who should be on the leadership team, and what are their roles?
Well, I think there are a couple key people that need to be involved. And the first is an administrator who has a knowledge of the funding mechanisms that can help to support the process. Because there are several constraints, especially from the federal perspective, on what can be used and what cannot be used for RTI below kindergarten. So you need someone who has that background knowledge and can be creative in braiding funding to support the process. The second, and Lydia alluded to, is the principal or the director of the center. They need to be knowledgeable about what their expectations are going to be for the teachers in those classrooms. RTI is also not just an instructional model, it's a classroom management rubric, so to speak. There's lots of intricacies that teachers need to be able to make in adjusting their curriculum and their routine to be able to implement those sorts of things. So I think it's critical that the principal be there, because often as a part of RTI, the teacher has to get pulled out of the room to do problem solving and brainstorming, and directors sometimes have a problem with releasing people out of the room. It's natural because then there's no one to watch or take care of the kids. Also having the specialists who may be responsible for providing some of the intervention, because again, this process needs to work into their schedule. And they're the ones that are knowledgeable about the types of interventions or curriculums that need to be used. And then I always like to involve some teachers, because teachers understand what the implications and demands are on their particular schedules, and they provide invaluable advice. And we implemented this process in an inner city child care center in Wilmington, Delaware. And it was really important for the teacher, because she kept bringing back to us, you want me to do this, but tell me when I'm supposed to get this done during the course of my day. And so we also had to work together with this particular teacher and be creative in helping her figure out how she could fit this in to the routine of the day, because she was by herself with 20 children.
And feeling a bit overwhelmed.
And feeling a bit overwhelmed, absolutely.
Okay. But it worked.
It worked. She felt very, she was actually, she often, I think Virginia alluded to, was amazed once she took the data actually and looked at it to see the progress that children were making, because a teacher with 20 children is so busy through the course of the day, they often can't take the time to step back and see the progress that's being made in the classroom unless they're doing ongoing assessment or unless they're using data and having some outside people come in and help them figure out, yes, you are making some progress. And she was delighted to see the success of some of the interventions that were happening.
Great. Charlie, let me come to you. Broadly speaking, what are the differences in these processes when you're looking at early childhood programs as opposed to K through 12?
Yeah, good point. Many of them are the same, and I would follow Jim's lead on what he just said about starting with an analysis of the Tier 1 curriculum in K through 12. That has to be done. The measurement piece has to be put in place, and that's a good place to start and get things rolling. Some of the differences, however, in K-12. I guess the concept, let me come back to early child, the concept of intentional teaching is relatively new to some sectors of early childhood. In K-12, intentional teaching is what teachers do. They teach reading, they're intending to teach, and they are being directed about it. In some sectors of early childhood, this is a new concept, and there's a long tradition of child-directed instruction rather than teacher-directed. So there's some issues, there's some issues to settle out there in programs to address that issue. There are a few other issues. That most of the teachers are trained at a higher level of kind of certification and years in the university and credentialed in some ways, and so those challenges aren't quite as great. The other ones, there are other issues, again, the administrative support and the funding background and the commitment of the district to the program are really similar processes that have to be put in place, as well as the heavy support for implementation.
Okay. Lydia, how does RTI affect the teachers' roles and what they do in their classrooms?
RTI is work, but the way that it affects teachers is by making them better, more targeted at what they're doing, and thereby more effective. And when teachers feel effective, then they're able to do more with their students. So teachers initially have some trepidation because there's more focus on them collecting data and them looking at what they can do to support the child, as opposed to a traditional, perhaps, mindset of thinking about what's wrong with this child. It's more about what can we do in our environment to ensure that we're meeting the needs of the children. So that initial shift means a lot more work and focus, but in the end, because they're making targeted decisions based on data, they can be more efficient and effective.
Okay. Jim, what sort of professional development would you say is most helpful in the early stages of implementing RTI?
I think helping teachers understand, and I mentioned this before, what it is that they need to look at. It was interesting, the conversation before about the necessity to assess several times throughout the year. You know, when children first come into the classroom, we always typically assess them to see what it is that they know. But we must remember the concept that as they progress through the year, the expectation that they learn more is always there. But sometimes some children are not catching up in January with what everybody else is learning. They may have been at a good place in September, but not necessarily at a good place in January. So it's helping teachers, I think, understand good child development. Intentional teaching is a very critical skill as well for teachers. Again, that is not necessarily a concept that teachers get as a part of their pre-service or in-service training. And I think it's a somewhat new phenomenon in terms of the concept perspective of that process. So I think that's another critical skill. And then collaborating and problem solving is another skill that we typically don't generate or nurture as a part of our pre-service and in-service training program. So working with teachers and practitioners to help them work together with their colleagues, so that, because teachers don't need to feel like they need to do this by themselves.
Exactly.
They need to feel it necessary to work with others.
Right.
So I'd like to add to that, and we promote an evidence-based practice approach to professional development, and that means you don't focus on general knowledge. You focus on skills, the actual practices. And so we start with a dilemma in making this relevant and real to teachers. And their dilemma is they want to make sure that every child learns and succeeds in school, but they may not know exactly how to accomplish that. And we move toward defining a practice, looking at the research evidence base for that practice, and demonstrating it. You know, actually giving them opportunities to see what it looks like, to try it out, to give them corrective feedback when they actually try to deliver it. And so it's an evidence-based approach that helps teachers acquire the actual practices that we want to see them implement in their own classrooms.
For example, what particular practice of something comes
The
to
assessment and intervention and instructional practices
Okay.
Around RTI. I mean, those are the practices that define RTI. So we bring those practices and the curricula and the assessment tools right into the professional development. It's not, you know, something that is abstract. It's concrete. We teach them in professional development, the actual assessment tools are the ones that they're practicing. They're the ones that they're going to be using when they get back to their classrooms.
Okay. Charlie?
And then we actually do some measurement and assessment of fidelity of implementation. So it's actually a look at, okay, we've trained, is it there?
Right.
And that's another aspect we probably won't talk too much about, but that's another part of our RTI is implementation to a level of fidelity, so we know that the practice is in place.
Okay.
Yeah.
Jim, let me come back to you. What role does the state and the district support play in the successful adoption of RTI in early childhood settings?
Well, probably the biggest component would be the availability of fiscal resources. As I mentioned before, IDEA allows districts and the state to utilize federal funding for response to intervention for kindergarten and above, and they've been pretty explicit in saying that those funds are not to be used below kindergarten. So it requires districts and the state to work collaboratively to figure out what other fiscal resources could the state or local district bring to bear to support those sorts of practices. And some examples would be Title I funds could be made available. States that offer state pre-kindergarten programs, those funds could be utilized because those environments become available for children to be in. Local school district funding certainly has flexibility. What we've come to understand is that there's greater flexibility in state and local funding to support RTI practices, and federal funds tend to have a bit more restrictive in that process. So funding is one particular component to that. The other is allowing the practice to happen. And actually supporting that practice. So, working with the principals and directors of centers to say, you need to support your teachers coming out of the room. You need to support individuals from outside your center coming into your center to support your staff. So there are two distinct fiscal and then personnel resources.
Okay, so what does good rollout of RTI look like?
I think a good process would be to first step back again to see what are the capacities and competencies of your particular program. What do your staff look like? What are their capabilities to be able to implement that practice? So do you have good Tier 1 instruction occurring, and spending some time first taking a look at that? Are all of your teachers and staff have good backgrounds in the curriculum expectations that you have? And then to begin to look at what are the individual practitioners' capacities to do the sorts of interventions that we've talked about. Do they have the capability to take data? Do they have the capability to problem solve? And so do they have the capability to have other adults come in their room and to guide them and coach them in the ability to do that? Along with that would be, is the system itself set up to provide the coaching and specialized supports that teachers are going to need? Because we should not have the expectation that a classroom teacher is a be-all and can do it all by themselves, that they do need that outside support. And so we need to make sure that as we prepare that process to occur, that all those steps are in place so that the teacher is not left hanging by themselves with an expectation that they can't fulfill.
Yeah, I'm sure they're glad to have some support there. You want to weigh in on that?
Well, Jim, we always tell teachers this is not a decision that teachers can make on their own. I mean, teachers cannot on their own decide, I want to implement RTI tomorrow in my classroom. This is a program level decision. And so those kinds of supports that Jim was talking about have to be in place. Somebody has to decide, well, what are the assessment tools we're going to use? What are the interventions we're going to use? And these are not decided individually by teachers. These are program level decisions that need to be made to support teachers.
Charlie?
I would like to just add to that RTI implementation is a process that you can't expect to be completely finished in 1 year. And it's an orderly process of establishing components we've discussed, seeing how they're doing, making new planning, and forming goals about what the next step along the RTI path is about. So it's a several year, at least, full rollout.
Okay.
But people don't want to hear that, Charlie.
Yeah, well,
I mean, Charlie, take it back.
No,
just
they
take it
don't.
back.
They don't want to hear it's going to take you a year or longer. I fully agree with you, but I think they're disappointed because once they decide to get on board, it's like, let's do it. Let's do it this fall, and it might be July when they're saying that.
Right, and then they'll know that after they're in it for a while, that they can't do it entirely in that way. And in fact, it might be harmful because too many things going on tends to make the program look not functional.
Oh, okay. Lydia, what was the challenge about the rollout at Appletree?
Well, we're still rolling it out. We are continuing to improve our program, but I think the initial challenge was that our teachers did not come in with a background of interventionists. So we were having to train them as they had these children that they needed to serve how to do that. So that could be frustrating at times because they want an immediate quick fix and they want the expert to come in and save the day. And really showing teachers that they can be the experts on their children with the support, with the ongoing professional development through coaching and the didactic workshops that are related to the coaching that's going to happen in the classroom. So initially it was teachers being used to having someone come in and fix it for them. And now we were really focusing on them supporting the students and having the data, using the data, implementing with fidelity, all of those things were foreign. So through a whole lot of professional development, a lot of in-class coaching, and a lot of pep talks. And
They were empowered.
They were empowered.
Right. Okay. Jim, what should well-intentioned but poorly funded programs do about RTI?
Well, I think that they need to feel that they can't accomplish it all if they don't have the funding to be able to do that. And my recommendation in those particular situations is for them to largely focus on their Tier 1 curriculum practices. Make them as good as possible with the staff that they need. Bring enough professional development support in there for their staff to be able to do that. And perhaps if with the limited funds, making sure that the curriculum that they're using has some evidence that it's effective, and not try to use that eclectic approach,
Right.
But to be much more intentioned on what they do, and then seek outside support to bring in the interventions that may be necessary for them to be able to do that.
Okay. Now I've got a question for everybody. Why do you think programs should adopt RTI? Charlie, stepping up to the plate.
Well, I just have the answer.
Okay.
Well, I think for me, RTI offers the opportunity for early childhood to reach out to a greater level of effectiveness with the children, and compared to what they're doing already, and continuing to do the same things that in the same ways that we've been doing doesn't offer us this opportunity. So yes, there are costs, and yes, there's work to do, and there's challenges, but I think it does offer us that opportunity.
Okay, Lydia.
I think programs should adopt it because we know that early intervention can work. We know that it can work to diminish the number of children who are overrepresented in special education. We know that it can work to support children financially into the future with jobs, with college readiness, with college completion. So really starting at this age is critical, again, as a social justice issue, going back to my opening discussion.
Okay. Virginia?
I think it's the big idea in education right now. It's the big idea in K-12, and it's a new big idea in early childhood. But I think the reason it's such a big idea is because we need to customize education for children to meet the diverse needs of the children in education. Children who are dual language learners, children from diverse cultural and linguistic backgrounds, children with learning difficulties. This is a way to customize and address the needs of children who differ in the way they learn.
Well, why are we expecting all children to learn the same way when all children are different? Just a question.
Children learn in different ways,
Right.
but we can set expectations, high expectations, for every child to succeed. And that's, I think, what we aim to do.
Okay, Jim.
Well, your comment's an interesting one because I think that we've all often have had the perspective that the way curriculums are structured, that all children do learn the same way because that's the way curriculums are developed and often implemented by teachers. So I like to think of RTI as more of a response to instruction rather than a response to intervention. So what we're doing is we're helping teachers to learn how to differentiate and individualize instruction based on how individual children perform and develop. So it's a different perspective to take, but it offers a valuable one because I think that's where we see the greatest change in development when teachers individualize what they do with children.
Okay. Well, I want to thank you all so very much. What we're going to do now is we're going to take some questions from our studio audience and some others that we've received by email. So why don't we have that first question, please? Thank you.
I'd like to know what research-based Tier 2 and 3 interventions are you aware of that support child development in pre-K?
Lydia?
Okay. Well, there are not very many evidence-based programs for early childhood, but there are a few high-quality intentional instruction programs that are out. And I would advise teachers to think about using the instructional programs that are most helpful for their students' needs. So when they collect the data and when they look at where their children are, really focusing on this is where my child is, and this particular component of this program is what I'm going to use. So I wouldn't say adopt a program as this is the end-all be-all that's going to work for all children.
Okay, how do you all feel about that?
Well, I think that's a very good point because it speaks to the two aspects of evidence-based practice that I mentioned earlier, and that is the answer follows up that teachers should, if they're collecting their own local data and making decisions on practices and their effectiveness within their program, they are in a position over a period of time and use of those practices to decide if this is a good one or not. The other side of it is we have a lot of work to do with having better information about standard Tier 2 and Tier 3 practices, and some of the work in our center, we're developing that evidence.
Okay. All right, let's take an email. It says, when teachers are resistant to change, how do you get buy-in for an RTI initiative? Lydia.
First, I think it comes from the leadership, the team that should involve teachers and parents and the district leaders and the principals. So having that team make a decision that response to intervention is the school's program, so that when you run up against that that resistance initially, the standard response is, how can we help you to do it better, not do you have to do it or not. I think if you can stop that right away, then you'll get a little bit of the resistance to go away. And then you have to provide the support and the training so that you're not just throwing teachers out there and expecting them to do a good job. So I think first, making a decision that this is what we're going to do, training the teachers on what it is, and then providing that ongoing support so that they can do it well. And Virginia talked earlier about how once teachers see the data, they're so rewarded. That is truly its own reward when a teacher can see the work and the effort that he or she has put in to this individual child or this small group of children has resulted in that line going up, up, up. That makes a big difference, and that is the buy-in.
Okay. Let's take another question from our audience. Please go ahead.
How would fidelity of implementation be ensured for interventions in an early childhood center?
Jim, you want to take that?
Sure. Well, I think what you need to do is look at the expectations and from the curriculum itself. What is it that you expect as part of the outcome? So you're actually using a combination of what is the curriculum expectations are, as well as, and I mentioned this before, what are the early learning guidelines that we want children to accomplish at the end, and consistently tie in to make sure using perhaps teaching rubrics, classroom observations on an ongoing basis, as well as using what was mentioned before, some of the progress monitoring and screening tools, integrating those different components together to consistently make sure that children are making the progress that they need to make throughout the course of the year, and not just waiting, using a summative approach, waiting until May to make a determination if children have been making the progress that you wanted them to do, but do that on an ongoing basis, because if you make a determination that some children or groups of children are not where they need to be, that's going to give you the information to say that perhaps you need to change some of your instructional curricular practices so that you're moving everybody as best along the same path.
Okay. Let's take did you want to add something, John?
Well, I would just add that using some of the members of the building or program support team as kind of implementer observers, and helping colleagues implement to the goals that have been and standards that have been set is another helpful aspect.
Yeah. Okay. One of the tools that we've used with our teachers, we've taken our early learning guidelines from the state, and we've developed weekly and monthly rubrics for the teachers to assess have they been planning activities that directly affect or are linked to the expectations that we have for children at the end of the year. So are they planning activities that incorporate colors? Are they planning activities that incorporate dialogic reading practices? Are they, so they monitor and self-check themselves as well as having others, because we want teachers to be able to develop some of those independent skills on their own.
Can I just add one thing? We actually, the approach we take is we standardize the Tier 2 interventions. Once we figure out what particular skills teachers need to focus on with a particular group, we give teachers a structured set of lessons. And so that helps ensure that everybody's implementing the same intervention. You're not getting as many different interventions as you have teachers.
Okay, let's take another question from our audience. Thank you.
Hello. Are there any states or local sites presently using RTI for preschool successfully?
That sounds like a Charlie question.
Well, we've been at our center impressed with the folks in Illinois, for example, that they seem to have a rather extensive rollout of RTI in early childhood centers there. So that's one good example.
Okay, thank you. Let's take an email question. It says, Head Start has a federal requirement to service children with an IEP. If school districts are using response to intervention and finding fewer children eligible for special education, and therefore fewer children with IEPs, they will not meet their federal requirement. Any suggestions on how to handle this? Jim?
Well, I think perhaps that's somewhat of a misnomer, I would say. That, well, first of all, response to intervention is not, especially below preschool, below kindergarten, should not be seen as an eligibility determination process. It's a way to focus particular instruction for children who need additional development and support. So I don't think that the RTI process is necessarily deterring some children with disabilities from being identified. And I think that there are other practices, in my opinion, that programs like Head Start need to do to identify children who are already in their community who may have a disability, who would benefit from bringing in that Head Start program. I don't think programs should be waiting to take in a group of 20+ children and hoping that a couple of those children are going to wind up being identified and then feeling bad because the RTI process prevented that. What we're trying to do is to actually find strategies and implement interventions to reduce the number of children who are misidentified as potentially eligible for special education.
Right, Jim, I've actually heard people say things like, children have to go through all the tiers before I can refer them for further evaluation, which is completely untrue.
Right.
Okay. I've got the amen corner over here. All right, let's take another question from our audience.
I'd like to ask the panel to discuss how RTI principles might be applicable to short-term and non-classroom settings, such as daycare and respite centers, with individuals, children or adults, whose cognitive levels are in the pre-K range.
Charlie?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think there's a lot of room for thought and trying out the approaches with that population. One example, a closely related example, is the work of myself and colleagues in the early childhood, or in the early Head Start program, so birth to 3. So a much younger population of at-risk children in early Head Start. And we've developed indicators of growth and development, RTI measures for that population. And we just published a randomized trial showing that home visitors using those strategies of RTI working with parents in the home to implement a language promoting intervention in the home was significantly valuable. So how that would play out in the other settings that you've mentioned, I think the principles give you a direction, and you need to think something about measurement and what Tier 1 is about.
Okay, let's take another question. We have an email question. This one says, can you suggest any specific state or federal funding sources available to support RTI implementation? That sounds like a Jim question.
Yeah, I think, well, I mentioned a couple opportunities before. Title I is certainly an interesting vehicle. While I mentioned before that often federal funding tends to be somewhat restricted, Title I, it tends to be a program that offers a bit more flexibility, and I think can be structured such that they're great environments for a variety of children, especially in schools, for instance, that are Title I or district-wide Title I programs, which would allow any child to benefit from being a part of that process. Many states now are involved in offering state pre-kindergarten or universal pre-K. Washington, D.C. Has a universal pre-K program, and again, where you have state and local funding, there tends to be much more flexibility in how you utilize those particular dollars to be able to support children who need those resources.
Okay, let's take another question from our audience. Thank you so much.
Hello. I'd like to ask the panel if you have any suggestions on helping students make the transition to kindergarten so that the kindergarten teachers do not start the RTI process all over again.
All right.
I'll
You'll
take a
start?
stab at it.
Okay.
I think this is another frontier for us. I mean, we have not yet gone there. I think it is an important future direction, is that we need to think about how this could actually promote smooth transitions to kindergarten. It will involve transferring data and sharing data and getting permissions to do that, and we're not there yet. But I share the concern that teachers might be starting from scratch, reinventing the wheel, beginning to gather information to figure out which children need additional supports when there is an entire year, perhaps, of experience with a particular child. And that right now, we don't have good mechanisms in place to share that information.
Lydia?
I think at a school level, what we try to do is empower parents to understand the power of them taking their students' data with them to their kindergarten teacher, so that and then we're putting it in the student's record when they leave our schools. But the parent is the person who's going to enroll that child at the next location. So until we can get a universal data system or something like that that's district or national, just having the parent know that that's an important thing to do and that they have the expectation that that next teacher would look at those data and use that when they're starting to instruct their child.
Okay. Charlie?
Yeah, and so another important aspect of alignment in the early childhood programs is to also, in addition to state standards, to look at what are the expectations for children in kindergarten and how are we earlier promoting those and getting them on the right path.
Okay. Let's take another email question. When should a child in a preschool setting be referred for a comprehensive evaluation to determine if there is a disability? And I'm just going to throw that out.
At any point where there's a question or a concern raised by a parent or a teacher, right then and there. There's no waiting, there are no tiers to go through.
Okay.
That would be my answer.
Charlotte?
Yes,
Okay.
I agree.
I would say yes. I would say that the system should train teachers on how to make those determinations so that every child who comes to you who might not, let me put it a different way. In our programs, we can get children who come in and 85% of them may look like they should get a diagnosis based on their baseline test scores.
Right.
So are we referring 85% of our children? We could, but we also could teach teachers about how developmentally this might be within a range, so we could try instruction first and intervention in the classroom. We shouldn't deter them if they're, if they really have a strong concern, but we should also provide some training beforehand so that children aren't, again, over-identified.
Okay. Let's take another question from our audience.
Hi, can you tell us more about ways parents are encouraged to be involved with RTI in early childhood, and why is it important?
Well, I'll start off by saying that one of the practices we tried to put in place with the centers that we work with is to give parents a questionnaire to, right off the bat, try to get a good handle on what the background has been and the experiences of that child before they came to the site where they're currently at. Because you can have, many times have children have been in a situation where they've not been in care, or they've been involved in a setting that has been less than supportive in that child's development. So to give you some background to understand where that child is coming from as they enter into that particular setting and site, and where you're starting the referral process.
So this is an area that worries me a little bit, to be honest, because we're operating outside of any kind of procedural safeguards in terms of how to, we have those safeguards within IDEA for children who are served within special education. But in the absence of policies and guidance, I worry a little bit about how programs will go about creating ways of involving families without any kind of safeguards for how information will be shared, how families will be involved. I think it's an area where we need to really focus our efforts. If we're going to implement RTI, I think it's absolutely crucial that families be involved as full partners.
Okay. Lydia, did you want to comment?
Quickly.
Okay.
I just want to say that at our schools, we try to involve parents from the very beginning with those questionnaires, but then also if a Tier 2 plan is seen to be needed, inviting the parent to the meeting for that, inviting the parent to the progress monitoring meetings that occur at least bi-weekly so that they can come in and see how their child is progressing. But also informing the parent up front, if at any time you are concerned about your child, then you do have the right to request assessments, and not making parents think that they do have to go through this process, but that this process is meant to see what the teacher can do in the classroom to support their child, and then trying to involve and support them at home as well. So trying to have some carryover between what's happening in the school and what's happening.
Right, and I would just say, Lydia, it sounds great that you're doing that and you're being careful, but those rights are not specified within RTI for pre-K. They are within IDEA. And so not all programs may be as responsible as yours, so that's why I worry.
Okay. All right, let's take another question from our audience. Thank you so much.
What type of training would early childhood specialists require in order to properly implement RTI?
Virginia?
I think we hit on this a little bit earlier when we talked about professional development. I talked about an evidence-based practice approach. I think that you have to have, prior to professional development, there has to be some strategic planning and some decisions made about who are we targeting. Is this a system-wide effort? Are we focusing on a particular age group, 4-year-olds or 3 to 5s or infants and toddlers? And then there are a whole host of questions and decisions that go along with that, in terms of the assessments that are appropriate for different age groups and tools. Then once those decisions are made, then those get folded into the professional development. They become the content of the professional development. So there's a lot of decisions, planning that lead up to effective professional development in my view.
Okay. Let's take another question from our audience. Oh, I'm sorry. I'll tell you what, why don't we do an email instead? All right. There are some programs where teachers have advanced degrees and where there is more money to spend on supplies. You like that, don't you, Jim?
I do.
How would this system work in places that do not have access to those resources?
In some cases, I think that we need to be cautious around that, and I think I talked about this a bit before. Where those resources are not there, I think we need to be careful about making expectations that cannot be delivered in particular situations. So where you have a poorly resourced center that concentrate on 1 or 2 items, again, I would focus on the curriculum, and have that particular site then look outside their own facility to see what supports might be made available, either from, say, perhaps a local school district, or perhaps there's a university within some location that can come in and provide some support. Also, look to a state's, most states now have a professional development process supporting young children and practitioners, and perhaps trying to tap in to the state's resources around professional development using their Child Care Development Fund and the focus on quality instruction. And utilizing some of those. So again, I think we can't expect all centers to be everything to everybody, and needing to be cautious about and being realistic about what the capacities of particular sites are.
Okay. Lydia's been shaking her head, and then I'll come back to you, Virginia.
I was agreeing with Jim that if you have a particularly under-resourced center, really focusing on high-quality Tier 1 is going to be the best approach, because it's going to support the majority of your students if you're doing that well with fidelity. But another thing that programs might try to do if they were in that situation is to form collaboratives with similar size programs that have the same types of problems, and then pull their money and do some professional development with each other, or go through the other resources that Jim alluded to already.
Virginia?
Just wanted to mention that if a pre-K program or classroom is in a setting where they have access to people who are implementing RTI for older children, we have found that involving members of those teams in the process of figuring out what this looks like for younger children has been really helpful. They often don't have the background in working with younger children, but they really, really, really know RTI and can help early childhood folks figure it out.
Okay. Well, let's go back to our audience and take another question. Thank you so much for asking.
Hi, I was wondering if RTI can successfully be implemented in an early childhood classroom where the teaching philosophy is play-based learning?
Lydia?
I would say yes, if the teacher is focused on intentional teaching during the play. So you can have a play-based learning approach where the teacher is focused on targeting and facilitating that play to target the needs of children. So if the teacher is collecting data, using that data to even set up the play environment. So what are the activities that are available to the children to play with in the classroom is something that a teacher could maneuver and manipulate in an RTI system.
Yeah, and it would be, looking in the same way, looking to see what activities and play would most support the goal of the RTI, the target, and the learning outcomes.
Right, and I would just add that our expectations of what children can learn at this age are changing. What's considered developmentally appropriate at this age is changing. And it now includes the fact that we understand that children can learn things like letter names, and they can differentiate letter sounds, and we didn't think that 5 or 10 years ago. So it's just expanding our notions of what's appropriate for this age group.
And they sure are learning technology, aren't they?
And they are.
Okay. What I'd like to do is say thank you, and I'd like to get a final thought from each of you. What should people remember about implementing RTI in early childhood settings? Charlie, let me start with you.
What should they remember? Well, I think they need a grounding in the components and the background that we've discussed today. They should remember that. They should remember some of the issues about how this is different than traditional practice, and also that the fact that it's going to take some effort and resources to achieve it. But remember, if we do the same thing in the same way, we don't make progress.
Okay. Lydia?
I think that people should remember that beginning with high quality Tier 1 is the foundation for a successful response to intervention program, and that they should not try to layer on interventions onto a low quality program. So really starting with meeting the needs of the most children they can through their everyday experiences in the classroom.
Jim?
I would go back to and repeat a statement I made earlier, which is I like to think of response to, or RTI as response to instruction. and that what we're doing is establishing a set of practices for practitioners to better intentionalize instruction for children, and better intentionalized instruction will result in children developing along the paths that they should.
In Virginia.
I think there's a lot of fear out there, quite honestly, because of a few examples of bad practice. And so I would say, think about RTI as just a way of improving teaching and trying to help teachers be more intentional, more systematic, and address the needs of every single child in their classroom.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I want to say thank you all so much for joining us, as well as our audience. And thank you for joining us for this RTI National Online Forum. For more information about RTI, please visit us on the web at www.rtinetwork.org. And again, thank you so much for being with us. Take care.
This RTI National Online Forum is presented by the RTI Action Network, a program of the National Center for Learning Disabilities. Funding is provided by the Emily Hall Tremaine Foundation.